My name is Ilara. For most of my 34 years, I've considered myself a quiet observer, someone who finds more comfort in the gentle turn of a page than in the clamor of a crowded room. I grew up in a house of whispers, the only child of two librarians who loved books more than they loved conversation. Our home was a sanctuary of silence, and I learned to navigate the world by listening, by watching, by making myself small enough not to disturb the peace. It was a skill that served me well in my career as an architectural archivist, where my days are spent in the hushed halls of the Port Blossom City Archives, tracing the histories of buildings through faded blueprints and brittle documents. It was this love for history, for homes with soul, that led me to the Old Craftsman on Hawthorne Street. It had stood for over a century, a steadfast sentinel with a wide, welcoming porch and windows that seemed to hold the city's misty, pearlescent light. I bought it with the inheritance my parents left me, a final, silent gift. It was my name on the deed, my savings that paid for the new roof and the restored hardwood floors. It was supposed to be my sanctuary. But a house is not a home until it's filled with life, and I had fallen in love with a man who brought with him a life far louder than any I had ever known. Leo was all charm and easy laughter, a whirlwind of energy that swept away my quiet reservations. He was an artist, he said, a sculptor who worked with reclaimed metal, though his studio in our garage was more a graveyard of unfinished projects than a hub of creation. I loved his dreams, the way his eyes would light up when he talked about the shapes he saw in rust and ruin. I thought we were building a future together, piece by piece. 2 years into our marriage, his father, Arthur, came to live with us. His health was beginning to falter, a bad heart, a touch of emphysema from a lifetime of smoking, and Leo insisted it was our duty to take him in. I agreed without hesitation. My own quiet house had always felt too large for one, and the idea of a real, bustling family, with its overlapping voices and shared meals, was a dream I'd long held. What I didn't understand was that in Leo's world, family was a one-way street, and I was expected to pave it with gold. The transition was subtle at first. Leo quit his part-time job at the gallery to be available for Dad. Arthur, a man whose pride was as expansive as his list of ailments, couldn't possibly be expected to contribute from his meager pension. So, the weight of the household, the mortgage, the soaring utility bills, the ever-increasing grocery costs, Arthur's prescription co-pays, Leo's art supplies, settled onto my shoulders. I carried it because I thought that's what love was. A quiet shouldering of burdens, a silent sacrifice for the good of the whole. I told myself they appreciated it, that their lack of thanks was just their way. But over 4 years, the silence of gratitude curdled into the silence of expectation. My salary became a communal resource, my home a hotel where I was the sole proprietor and benefactor. I became the foundation they stood upon, and I was beginning to crack. The rain had been falling for 3 straight days, a persistent, mournful drum against the windowpanes of the living room. It was a sound I usually loved, the city's gentle lullaby, but tonight it felt oppressive, trapping me inside with the stale air of resentment. I was curled on the armchair, a book open on my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in an hour. Across the room, Arthur was watching a nature documentary, the volume turned up to a level that made the floorboards vibrate. "Ilara," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of a lion. He didn't turn from the television. "We need to talk." I placed my bookmark carefully between the pages. "What is it, Arthur?" He finally swiveled his head, his gaze settling on me with a familiar, appraising look, the one he used when he was about to ask for something. "My truck is on its last legs. The transmission is shot. It's a death trap." I nodded slowly. "I'm sorry to hear that. A good mechanic might be able to." "A mechanic is a waste of money," he interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Pouring good money after bad. No, I've been looking at a new one. A nice Ford. Reliable. Roomy." A cold knot formed in my stomach. I knew where this was going. "That sounds nice," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "It is," he said, a self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. And I found a dealership with a great financing deal. All I need is a decent down payment. 5,000 should do it. He paused, letting the number hang in the air between us. You've got the money. I've seen your statements from that investment thing your parents left you. The casual intrusion, the sheer audacity of it, took my breath away. He had gone through my mail. The knot in my stomach tightened into a shard of ice. For years, I had quietly managed the household finances, paying every bill without complaint. The monthly cost of supporting them was already close to $4,000, consuming nearly every penny I earned after taxes. My inheritance was my only safety net, a last vestige of my own life, my own security. Arthur, I began, my voice softer than I intended. I can't do that. His smile vanished. What do you mean, you can't? Of course, you can. Don't be dramatic. It's not dramatic, I said, finding a sliver of firmness. I already cover all the expenses for this house. The mortgage, the food, everything. That $5,000 it's my emergency fund. It's for the future. I'm the future, he boomed, his voice suddenly thick with indignation. I'm your husband's father. I gave him life. I've done my part. It's time you did yours. A new truck isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. How am I supposed to get to my appointments? Leo can drive you, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Or there are ride services. We can figure something else out. I'm not going to be chauffeured around like some invalid, he spat, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. You owe me this. You live in my son's house. This is my house, Arthur, I said, the words finally escaping, sharp and clear. The shock of my own defiance hung in the air. His eyes narrowed. He pushed himself out of his recliner, his body tense with a rage that seemed to suck the air from the room. You're just like your mother, he sneered, the words a low blow, referencing a woman he'd never even met. Cold and selfish. Thinking you're better than everyone. He took a step towards me, his presence looming and aggressive. The living room, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. The stairs leading down to the front door were directly behind my armchair. Don't you dare disrespect me, he growled, jabbing a finger in the air. Not in this house. I'm not disrespecting you, I said, standing up, trying to hold my ground. I'm setting a boundary. The word seemed to enrage him further. Before I could process what was happening, he lunged, not with a fist, but with his whole body, shoving me hard with both hands against my shoulders. My feet, clad in soft wool socks, slipped on the polished hardwood. The world tilted violently. There was a sickening sensation of falling backward, a kaleidoscope of the ceiling, the wall, the staircase. I let out a cry that was swallowed by the impact. My body tumbled down the short flight of stairs, my arm catching awkwardly beneath me, my head cracking against the thick oak of the newel post at the bottom. A brilliant, searing flash of pain exploded behind my eyes, followed by a wave of nausea. For a long moment, I lay crumpled at the foot of the stairs, the world a blurry, humming mess. The rain drummed on, indifferent. From the top of the stairs, I heard Arthur's ragged breathing. He didn't rush down. He didn't call my name. He simply stood there, a dark silhouette against the living room light. That's what you get, he rasped, his voice filled with a chilling satisfaction. When you forget your place. He turned and walked back toward the blaring television. Tears of pain and shock stung my eyes. I tried to push myself up, but a sharp, electric agony shot from my wrist up to my shoulder. My head throbbed in time with my frantic heartbeat. It was then that Leo appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the commotion. He looked down at me, his face not filled with alarm or concern, but with a familiar, weary annoyance. Ilara, he said, his tone flat. He didn't move to help me. What happened? Your father, he pushed me, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Leo sighed, a long, exasperated sound that shattered the last, fragile piece of my heart. He ran a hand through his hair. "Well, you know how he gets when he's worked up," he said, with a slight shrug. "Honestly, was it really worth all this? You probably should have just given him the money for the truck." Lying there, broken and bruised on the floor of my own home, I looked up at the man I had promised to love and cherish. And in his eyes, I saw nothing. No love, no empathy, just a selfish desire for the path of least resistance. The physical pain in my arm and head was immense, but it was nothing compared to the profound, hollow ache of that final betrayal. This wasn't a family. It was a parasitic relationship, and I was the host. The rain continued to fall, but for the first time, I felt a strange sense of clarity, as if the water was washing away years of self-deception. I had been making myself small for so long, I had nearly disappeared. But the impact, the pain, the cold indifference on my husband's face, it had woken me up. That night, after a silent, agonizing trip to an urgent care clinic confirmed a fractured wrist and a mild concussion, I waited until they were both asleep. Moving with a quiet deliberation I hadn't felt in years, I packed a single bag. My hands shook, not from fear, but from a burgeoning, unfamiliar strength. I didn't write a note. I didn't look back. I walked out of the front door of the house on Hawthorne Street, closing it softly behind me, and drove into the rain-slicked, glittering darkness of the city, not knowing where I was going, only knowing I could never go back. The motel room smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and damp carpet, an anonymous, sterile space that felt more like a sanctuary than my own home had in years. I sat on the edge of the stiff, polyester bedspread, my left arm in a sling, a dull ache throbbing in my head. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window, and for the first time in a long time, the silence was my own. It wasn't the strained silence of unspoken resentment, it was the vast, open silence of possibility. For years, I had been the steady, reliable bedrock of their lives. I had absorbed their demands, managed their moods, and paid for their comfort, all while convincing myself it was a noble sacrifice. Lying at the bottom of those stairs, I had finally understood that my quiet strength wasn't seen as a gift, but as an entitlement. My love wasn't cherished, it was consumed. The next morning, with the gray light of dawn filtering into the room, I made the most important call of my life. I found the number for a law firm that specialized in family and property law, one with a woman's name at the top. Clara Dunn's office, a warm voice answered. "Hello," I said, my voice hoarse. "My name is Alara Vance. I need to speak with Ms. Dunn. It's about my husband and my home." Clara Dunn's office was in a restored heritage building downtown, filled with light and the scent of old paper and brewing tea. She was a woman in her 50s with kind, intelligent eyes and a calm, reassuring presence that immediately put me at ease. She listened without interruption as I recounted the story of the last 4 years, my voice gaining strength as I spoke. I told her everything, the slow financial takeover, the constant, unspoken pressure, the demand for the truck, and finally, the shove down the stairs and Leo's chillingly casual response. When I finished, I felt emotionally hollowed out, but also lighter, as if I had finally unburdened myself of a toxic secret. Clara leaned forward, her expression a mixture of compassion and steely resolve. "Alara, what you've been describing is a classic, deeply painful pattern of financial and emotional abuse. The fact that it culminated in a physical assault is, unfortunately, not surprising." She paused, then asked the question that would change everything. "The house on Hawthorne Street. Whose name is on the deed and the mortgage?" "Mine," I said without hesitation. "Solely mine. I bought it before we were married, with my inheritance. Leo's name isn't on any of it. He couldn't have qualified for the loan." A small, knowing smile touched Clara's lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of validation. "Then this is very straightforward, legally speaking," she said gently. "It is your house, Alara. Not their house. Not your son's house. Yours. And you have every right to decide who lives in it." The simple, powerful truth of her words resonated deep within me. For years, they had chipped away at my sense of ownership, making me feel like a guest, a caretaker in my own life. "So, what do we do?" I asked, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope. "We reclaim your home," Clara said, her tone firm. "We will begin by drafting formal eviction notices for both your husband, Leo, and his father, Arthur. They will be given 30 days to vacate the premises, as required by state law." Eviction. The word sounded so harsh, so final. A wave of guilt washed over me, a knee-jerk reaction conditioned by years of prioritizing their comfort. But then I remembered the cold floorboards, the throbbing pain in my wrist, and the empty look in my husband's eyes. This wasn't about punishment, it was about survival. "And the assault?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Arthur pushing me?" "We address that as well," Clara said, her eyes meeting mine. "We will file a civil lawsuit against Arthur for assault and battery, seeking damages for your medical bills, your pain and suffering, and the emotional distress he caused. And we will name Leo in that suit as well, for financial exploitation. We need to hold them both accountable. This isn't just about getting them out of your house, it's about making it clear that their behavior has consequences." The word she used, accountable, was a revelation. I had spent so long making excuses for them that I had forgotten they were responsible for their own actions. Over the next few weeks, under Clara's guidance, I began to assemble the pieces of my case. It was a painful but validating process. I gathered bank statements, credit card bills, and receipts, laying them out on the small table in my new, temporary apartment, a furnished one-bedroom I'd found in a quiet neighborhood overlooking the marina. The numbers told a staggering story. Tens of thousands of dollars, a steady river of my earnings flowing into their lives with nothing in return. Seeing it all in black and white wasn't just infuriating, it was liberating. The evidence was irrefutable. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't being selfish. I was being exploited. Clara also had me write a detailed account of the night of the assault, documenting every word, every sensation. Reliving it was agonizing, but it cemented my resolve. Safety. It was a concept I had long since abandoned for myself, always ensuring they were safe, comfortable, and cared for. Now, for the first time, I was fighting for my own. I moved my most cherished belongings from the Hawthorne house to my new apartment in quiet, furtive trips. A box of my parents' books, my portfolio from work, the antique quilt my grandmother had made. The house felt like a ghost ship, heavy with the weight of unspoken tension. Leo seemed to barely register my partial absence, lost in his phone or tinkering aimlessly in the garage. Arthur, on the other hand, treated me with a sullen, simmering hostility, his glares following me from room to room. He was furious about the truck, but he clearly believed my refusal was a temporary tantrum I would soon get over. They had no idea what was coming. The hardest part was the silence. My friend Sarah, a fellow archivist, knew something was wrong. "You seem a million miles away, Elle," she'd said over coffee. I wanted to tell her everything, but the words felt too raw, the plan too fragile. I simply told her things were difficult at home, an understatement of monumental proportions. Lying in bed in my small, clean apartment, listening to the distant foghorns and the gentle lapping of water against the docks, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. I was terrified, yes, but beneath the fear was a current of exhilaration. I was taking the helm of my own life. I pictured their faces when the papers arrived, Arthur's blustering rage, Leo's slack-jawed confusion, and it wasn't a fantasy of revenge. It was the image of my own liberation. The day Clara finalized the documents, a feeling of profound calm settled over me. She would have them served by a professional process server. I wouldn't have to be there. "They are not going to react well," Clara warned me over the phone. "Be prepared for angry calls, for guilt trips, for manipulation." "I'm ready," I said, and for the first time, I truly believed it. "They've taken enough." The call came 2 days later. It was Leo. I let it go to voicemail. His message was a frantic, disjointed ramble. Ilara, what the hell is this? Some guy just showed up with legal papers. Eviction? This is insane. It's a mistake. Call me back. Dad is going ballistic. I deleted the message without a second thought. I did the same with the next 3 calls, and the string of texts that followed, each more desperate than the last. Arthur didn't call. He was a man who commanded, who demanded. He would never plead. That evening, I sat on my small balcony, a cup of tea warming my hands. The sky over the water was streaked with lavender and rose. The storm had passed. I had spent years weathering their storms, and now, finally, the forecast was clear. The 30-day countdown had begun. The 30 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. I lived in my small apartment by the marina, creating a new, gentle rhythm for my days. I went to work, took long walks along the waterfront, and spent evenings reading, the silence a comforting blanket. I did not return to the house on Hawthorne Street. Clara had advised against it, and I felt no desire to walk back into that charged atmosphere. My communication with Leo and Arthur was non-existent. After their initial flurry of furious and bewildered calls, they had fallen silent, a silence I could only interpret as them stewing in their own toxic brew of denial and rage. Clara kept me updated. Through back channels, she heard they hadn't packed a single box. They were operating under the delusion that this was a dramatic bluff, that I would eventually relent, return home, and things would go back to normal. They couldn't conceive of a world where I wouldn't. The 30th day arrived, a crisp, clear autumn morning. The air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Clara and I had arranged to meet near the house, along with 2 sheriff's deputies who would enforce the eviction order. As I drove toward my old neighborhood, my hands were steady on the wheel. The fear I had anticipated was replaced by a solemn, quiet resolve. I parked across the street, beneath the golden canopy of a maple tree, and watched as Clara, impeccably dressed and radiating an aura of calm authority, walked up the familiar stone path. She carried a briefcase containing the final court-stamped enforcement order. The deputies waited discreetly by their car. Clara rang the doorbell. After a long moment, the door creaked open and Arthur appeared. Even from a distance, I could see the defiant scowl on his face. He looked older, more haggard than I remembered, but his posture was rigid with indignation. I couldn't hear their words, but I could read their body language. Clara spoke calmly, handing him the papers. Arthur snatched them from her hand, his movements jerky. He glanced at them, then his voice erupted, a low, guttural roar that carried across the street. He gestured wildly at the house, at the sky, at Clara, his face contorting with rage. This is a travesty. I could now hear him bellow, his voice cracking. She can't do this. I've lived here for years. This is my family's home. Clara stood her ground, unflinching. She said something brief and pointed, then gestured toward the waiting deputies. That was their cue. The 2 officers walked calmly up the path. The sight of the uniforms seemed to momentarily stun Arthur into silence. The lead deputy, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gentle demeanor, began speaking to him in low, measured tones. Just then, Leo emerged from the house, rubbing his eyes as if he'd just woken up. He was wearing sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, a portrait of aimless inertia. He saw the deputies, saw Clara, and then his eyes found my car across the street. He froze. For a long moment, our gazes locked. In his eyes, I saw a storm of confusion, hurt, and a dawning, terrible understanding. This was real. This was happening. He took a few steps down the driveway, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Ilara, he called out, his voice thin and lost. Why are you doing this? We're your family. That word. Family. It had been their shield and their sword, the justification for every demand, every act of disrespect. I rolled down my window, the cool autumn air rushing in. I looked at the man I once loved, the man who had stood by and watched his father assault me, who had valued his own comfort over my well-being. I took a deep breath. A family is supposed to be a harbor, Leo, I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the quiet street. A safe place to anchor. You and your father, you were a storm. One I almost drowned in. He had no answer. He just stared, his mouth slightly agape. Arthur, meanwhile, had resumed his tirade, his voice rising in pitch. I won't leave. You'll have to drag me out of my son's house. The lead deputy spoke again, his voice firm but patient. He pointed to the order, then to the moving truck that Clara had arranged, which was now pulling up to the curb. They had no choice. Leo seemed to deflate. The fight went out of him, replaced by a profound, weary resignation. He turned and trudged back into the house. A few minutes later, he came out carrying a duffel bag and a cardboard box filled with his metal sculptures, the sad, twisted artifacts of his unfulfilled dreams. He didn't look at me again. He walked down the driveway and loaded his things into the back of Arthur's dying truck. The deputies escorted Arthur inside. For the next hour, I watched from my car as they were forced to pack. Movers, hired by Clara and paid for from an account I had set aside, efficiently and impersonally loaded their furniture and belongings into the truck. It was a surreal spectacle, the dismantling of the life I had so carefully, and so foolishly, underwritten. Arthur was the last to leave. He stalked out of the house, his face a mask of thunderous fury. He shot one last, venomous glare in my direction before climbing into the passenger seat of the truck. Leo got behind the wheel, and without a backward glance, they drove away, down Hawthorne Street and out of my life. The deputies secured the house, and Clara walked back to my car, a gentle smile on her face. It's done, she said, sliding into the passenger seat. The locks are being changed as we speak. It's yours again. Completely. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes, exhaling a breath I felt like I had been holding for 4 years. A profound, bone-deep wave of relief washed over me, so potent it felt like exhaustion. There was no joy in their defeat, no thrill in their humiliation. There was only the quiet, solemn, and overwhelming peace of an ending. Thank you, Clara, I whispered. For everything. You did this, Alara, she said softly, placing a reassuring hand on my arm. You found your strength. You just needed someone to remind you where to find the door. I opened my eyes and looked at the house. My house. The afternoon sun slanted across its porch, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It looked quiet. It looked peaceful. It looked like a sanctuary waiting to be reclaimed. I started the car, a small, genuine smile finally gracing my lips. Let's go, I said. I have a home to rediscover. The house on Hawthorne Street felt cavernous in its emptiness. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the constant hum of the television and the low grumble of Arthur's complaints that had become its soundtrack. As I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the bare hardwood floors, I wasn't haunted by ghosts of the past, but greeted by the promise of a future. The air smelled of lemon polish from the cleaners I'd hired, a fresh, clean scent that signified a new beginning. Clara had been right. It was my house again. The weight of their presence had been so immense that its absence was a physical sensation, like a pressure I hadn't known was there had finally been lifted from my chest. I ran my hand along the smooth, cool oak of the banister, the same banister my head had struck, and I felt not a phantom pain, but a sense of profound and final closure. I didn't stay in the house for long. The memories, though no longer painful, were a part of a life I was determined to leave behind. Selling it wasn't an act of running away, it was an act of deliberate release. It was a beautiful house, full of history and light, and it deserved a family who would build a home within its walls based on mutual love and respect, not obligation and resentment. Clara helped me find a realtor, and within a month, it was sold to a young couple with bright, hopeful eyes, who spoke excitedly of raising their children there. Handing them the keys felt like passing a torch. The civil lawsuit proceeded quietly in the background. Arthur and Leo, through a court-appointed lawyer, tried to countersue, claiming an ownership stake in the house. Clara dismantled their case with methodical precision, presenting the mountain of financial evidence I had collected. The judge dismissed their claim and ruled decisively in my favor, awarding me a settlement that covered my medical bills, legal fees, and a sum for emotional distress. It was never about the money. It was about the official, legal acknowledgement of the truth. It was validation, written into public record. I never knew if they paid it. Clara set up a collection process, but I told her not to tell me the details. Their debt was no longer my concern. My life settled into a new, beautiful pattern in my apartment by the marina. It was smaller than the house, but it was mine in a way the house had never truly been. It was a space that reflected me, shelves overflowing with books, walls adorned with nautical charts of the coastline, and a small easel set up by the window where I began to paint again, something I hadn't done since college. I painted seascapes, capturing the shifting moods of the water, sometimes calm and glassy, sometimes turbulent and gray, but always, always free. I reconnected with my friend, Sarah. Over long dinners and walks through the city's rose gardens, I told her everything. She listened with the fierce, unwavering support that is the hallmark of true friendship. "I can't believe you carried all that alone," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "You're the strongest person I know, Alara." Her words were a balm, helping to heal the parts of me that had been convinced I was weak for staying so long. I learned that strength isn't about how much you can endure, but about knowing when to stop enduring. It isn't about sacrificing yourself on the altar of someone else's comfort. True strength is the quiet, steady act of self-preservation. It's drawing a line in the sand and saying, no more. It's choosing the terrifying uncertainty of a new beginning over the soul-crushing certainty of a dead end. I never heard from Leo or Arthur again. I sometimes wondered where they ended up, what their lives looked like without me as their foundation. I hoped, for Leo's sake, that he might one day learn to stand on his own, but I knew it was not my responsibility to wonder, or to care. My energy was finite, precious, and I was finally investing it in myself. One cool, clear evening, I sat on my balcony, watching the last ferry of the day glide across the darkening water, its lights twinkling like fallen stars. The air was still, and the city across the bay was a glittering tapestry. A profound sense of peace settled over me, a quiet joy that was deeper and more resilient than any happiness I had known before. It wasn't the giddy, chaotic joy I had once mistaken for love with Leo. It was the calm, centered contentment of a woman who had walked through a storm and found herself, whole and unbroken, on the other side. The story I was living was no longer about them. It was not defined by their betrayal or my escape. It was a new story, one I was writing myself, line by line, brushstroke by brushstroke. The ending was still unwritten, the pages ahead blissfully blank, but for the first time in a very long time, I was not afraid. I was the archivist of my own life now, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the best chapters were yet to come.